May 16, 1943. 1,352 hours. North Atlantic, 48 degrees, 17 minutes north, 18 degrees, 55 minutes west. Captain Klaus Brenner stood in the conning tower of U-573, scanning the horizon through salt-crusted binoculars. Around him, 7 other U-boats ran on the surface in broad daylight, a formation that violated every principle of submarine warfare learned over 4 years of brutal Atlantic combat. Within 15 minutes, all 8 boats will be gone. Not to destroyers, not to corvettes, but to aircraft that should not have been able to reach this far into the Atlantic at all. The Americans called them Liberators, and on that spring afternoon, they would live up to their name in the most devastating 15 minutes of anti-submarine warfare the Kriegsmarine had ever experienced. The catastrophe that would unfold in the mid-Atlantic on May 16, 1943, began 6 weeks earlier in the concrete bunkers of Lorient, France. Admiral Karl Donitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, had summoned his senior U-boat commanders for an emergency conference. The topic: Allied air power was strangling the Wolfpack tactics that had nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic. Captain Klaus Brenner, commanding the 10th U-boat flotilla, presented a radical proposal documented in Kriegsmarine operational records. His analysis of Allied patrol patterns revealed a gap, a zone between 600 and 800 nautical miles from Newfoundland, where air coverage should be impossible. The consolidated B-24 Liberator had a documented range of 2,100 miles, but combat operations with full bomb load and patrol time reduced effective radius to approximately 600 miles from coastal bases. Brenner's plan was mathematically precise. By forming a surface convoy of 8 U-boats in the mid-Atlantic gap, they could achieve sustained speeds of 17 knots, triple their submerged speed. The intelligence failure was absolute. What German naval intelligence did not know, could not have known, was that British scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had solved the Liberator's range problem. Very long-range modifications included additional fuel tanks, reduced crew size, and stripped armament to extend operational radius beyond 900 miles. The B-24 Liberator, Northern Hunter, operating from Argentia, Newfoundland, carried Lieutenant Commander Robert Mitchell and a specialized anti-submarine crew. They possessed technology the Germans believed impossible: ASV Mark III radar, capable of detecting surface submarines at 18-mile range in any weather. German naval intelligence had no knowledge of its existence. The U-boats running on the surface below had no idea they were radiating a radar signature as clear as a lighthouse beam. At 1,337 hours, the radar operator, Petty Officer Second Class David Morrison, detected multiple contacts bearing 52 degrees, range 18 miles. The radar return showed 8 distinct targets in formation. Mitchell's after-action report, preserved in National Archives records, describes his immediate assessment: 8 surface contacts in military formation. Spacing and movement consistent with U-boat Wolfpack, proceed to attack altitude. The tactical situation favored the attackers completely. The Liberator approached from the southeast with the sun behind them, making visual detection difficult. The U-boats, focused on watching the northern and western horizons where they expected threats to originate, maintained their eastward course at 17 knots. The formation's anti-aircraft capability, while theoretically formidable with 64 total gun barrels across 8 boats, depended on early warning to man battle stations. Mitchell descended to 200 feet, approaching at 210 knots. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade Samuel Hayes, armed all 16 weapons. The bombardier, Ensign Michael Walsh, crouched in the nose position with the Norden bomb sight aligned. At 1,350 hours, lookouts on U-575, the rear boat in the western column, spotted the Liberator. Captain Lieutenant Franz Mueller, commanding U-575, transmitted the warning: aircraft bearing 140 degrees, altitude low, closing fast. The radio message intercepted by Allied listening stations would be U-575's last transmission. 7 U-boat commanders simultaneously recognized their nightmare scenario, caught on the surface by a 4-engine bomber with nowhere to run. Emergency dive procedures required 30 to 35 seconds from alarm to submergence. The Liberator was 40 seconds away. The anti-aircraft crews scrambled to their weapons, but coordination was impossible. Each U-boat captain faced an immediate tactical decision: dive and become a stationary target, or remain surfaced and fight with hastily manned guns. Brenner and U-573, at the formation's head, made the decision that sealed their fate. He ordered all boats to remain surfaced and engage. It was the last order he would ever give. 1,352 hours and 12 seconds. The Liberator's nose guns opened fire at 800 yards. Tracer rounds, 1 in every 5 bullets phosphorus-tipped for visibility, streaked toward the lead U-boat in brilliant lines that appeared almost leisurely in their flight. The 50 caliber rounds, each weighing over 1.5 ounces, impact U-573's conning tower at 2,700 feet per second. Brenner dies instantly as armor-piercing rounds tear through the submarine's pressure hull. The tactical plan was brutal in its simplicity. A straight strafing run down the length of the formation, releasing weapons sequentially at 3-second intervals. Mitchell's first depth charge detonates 50 feet from U-573's starboard side, lifting the entire submarine from the water. The explosion ruptures fuel tanks, igniting diesel that spreads across the surface in burning sheets. Within seconds, U-574 and U-576 suffer identical fates as the Liberator continues its devastating run, methodically destroying each boat in sequence. U-577 attempts an emergency crash dive, but catches a depth charge directly amidships. The explosion breaks the submarine's back, sending both halves to the bottom within minutes. Survivors from U-578 leap into the frigid Atlantic as their boat burns from stem to stern. Diesel fires creating black smoke columns visible for miles. U-579 returns anti-aircraft fire, tracers arcing toward the Liberator, but the bomber's speed and low altitude make accurate gunnery impossible. Mitchell's crew systematically works down the formation. Each U-boat dies within seconds of being targeted. The ocean fills with debris, oil slicks, and desperate men clinging to wreckage. Captain Ernst Weber of U-580 makes the only successful emergency dive, his boat disappearing beneath the surface just as the Liberator's guns swing toward his position. Above him, burning fuel and floating bodies mark where 7 submarines and 382 men met their end in less than 2 minutes of coordinated destruction. Captain Ernst Weber stood in the control room of U-580 with blood running from a cut on his forehead, knowing he had just experienced the luckiest moment of his life. Above, the Liberator circled the wreckage field, searching for the submarine that had escaped. 8 depth charges remained, but U-580 had disappeared into the Atlantic depths, and the Liberator's fuel gauges showed time to return to base. At 1,353 hours and 45 seconds, the attack ended. Elapsed time 1 minute 33 seconds. U-boats destroyed 7. Survivors in the water 68. Kriegsmarine losses 382 men dead or missing. The Liberator Northern Hunter turned northwest at 1,354 hours, climbing to 1,000 feet for the 8-hour flight back to Argentia. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's fuel gauges showed 900 gallons remaining, enough for the return flight with minimal reserve. The crew treated their wounded and counted their damage. 23 holes in the fuselage, 1 man dead, 2 wounded. The Canadian corvette HMCS Sackville, operating as part of Escort Group C3, received the coded transmission from Argentia at 1,447 hours. The message forwarded through naval intelligence channels provided precise coordinates and described multiple U-boats sinkings with survivors in the water. Commander Douglas Griffin, commanding Sackville, immediately altered course to maximum speed, 16 knots, toward the position 180 miles northeast of his patrol station. The corvette arrived at the coordinates at 18:25 hours, 4.5 hours after the attack. Sunlight slanted low across the Atlantic, illuminating an apocalyptic scene. Oil slicks stretched across square miles of ocean. Debris fields marked where submarines had gone down. Wooden planking, life vests, personal effects, and bodies, some moving, most not, floated in the wreckage. Griffin's after-action report, preserved in Canadian Naval Archives, described what his crew found with clinical precision but underlying horror. The water temperature of 44 degrees Fahrenheit gave unprotected swimmers approximately 90 minutes before hypothermia induced unconsciousness. 4.5 hours had elapsed. Of the 68 German submariners who had entered the water, Sackville's crew recovered 42 survivors. 31 were pulled aboard alive. 11 were dead from hypothermia, still wearing life vests that had kept their bodies afloat after death. 26 bodies were never recovered, lost to the Atlantic depths that had claimed their submarines. The survivors suffering from hypothermia, shock, and in several cases severe burns were brought to Sackville's sick bay and cramped crew quarters. Canadian sailors who hours earlier would have gladly killed these men now worked desperately to save them. Hot coffee, blankets, warm clothing, medical attention. The transformation from enemies to humans requiring aid occurred with remarkable speed. Griffin noted in his report that German and Canadian sailors, unable to communicate through language, nevertheless understood each other perfectly. Gross Admiral Karl Donitz received the report of Operation Neptune's destruction on May 17, 1943, at BDU headquarters in Berlin. The loss of 7 U-boats in a single action represented the worst single-day submarine loss of the entire war to that point. The psychological impact exceeded the material loss. If mid-Atlantic formation sailing was impossible, if Allied aircraft could reach positions previously considered safe, if radar could detect surfaced submarines beyond visual range, then the entire strategic foundation of Wolfpack tactics had collapsed. BDU operational orders issued May 19, 1943 marked a fundamental shift in U-boat doctrine. All formations sailing in daylight hours was prohibited. Submarines were ordered to transit individually, fully submerged during daylight, surfacing only for battery charging in darkness. The aggressive Wolfpack tactics that had nearly severed Britain's Atlantic lifeline were abandoned in favor of defensive evasion. The Battle of the Atlantic had reached its turning point. The sole surviving U-boat from Operation Neptune, U-580, continued operations until April 28, 1945, when it was sunk by destroyer escort USS Frederick in the final weeks of the European War. Captain Ernst Weber died with his boat. Of the crew that had survived May 16, 1943, only 16 lived to surrender. They carried survivors' guilt for having escaped while 382 comrades died, a burden documented in post-war psychiatric studies of U-boat veterans. Lieutenant Commander Robert Mitchell received the Navy Cross for the action on May 16, 1943. His citation noted that his aggressive attack, despite heavy anti-aircraft fire and at great risk to his aircraft and crew, resulted in the destruction of 7 enemy submarines and the removal of a major threat to Allied shipping. He flew 39 more combat missions before rotating stateside in December 1943. He survived the war and died in 1989 at age 74, never speaking publicly about the 15 minutes that killed 382 men. The 31 German survivors spent the remainder of the war in Canadian and American prisoner camps.